Morning. Thank you for inviting me. I think I'll take you a bit back on the TFTA. I understand you discussed it yesterday. My presentation will cover mainly three issues. I was asked mainly to focus on the principles for the negotiation, which I understand you touched on a bit yesterday, but also what South Africa expects out of the tripartite negotiations. I'll just briefly touch on the roadmap as well so that it sets a good basis for what is to follow in the presentation. In terms of the roadmap, you would be aware that in June 2011, in launching the TFTA negotiations, the summit agreed on a phased approach with phase one covering the trade in goods and phase two trade-related aspects, trade in services, IPR, competition, etc. There was also agreement on the principles that should inform the negotiations, and there's also been a negotiation around a common understanding and common interpretation of the principles, so that at least as we move into the negotiation process, all of us are on the same page in terms of how we approach the issues. The first principle is that the negotiations will be member states driven. I think this goes without saying, that, but also that recognizes the fact that you have customs unions within the tripartite member states, that is EAC and SACU, and in order to protect the common external tariff, those two blocks will negotiate as blocks. The second principle is a principle of variable geometry. In negotiating the tripartite, I think we also had to realize that we already have trading arrangements that exist between the three regions. You have a SADC protocol when it comes to SADC, then the EAC is the customs union, and COMESA is a free trade area, also attempting to operate as a customs union. So the tripartite process is not about unraveling what already exists, but it's about building on what already exists. So it will allow for coexistence of what already obtains at a regional level, and also allow for countries, given the differences in levels of development, to join at different stages. There's a criteria that is still to be negotiated and agreed in terms of how we'll approach that. So there will be various speeds that are allowed, but the aim is to ensure that what already obtains at a regional level is kept intact. The important point is to note is that variable geometry are key and reciprocity are considered to be complementary. So all of those will complement each other. Another principle is flexibility and special and differential treatment. I've already touched on this in that we are, it's 26 member states which are at various levels of development. The principle of flexibility and special and differentiated treatment is agreed and will be implemented, and will be how it will be implemented at the end will be an outcome of negotiation based on the specificities, the sensitivities of member states. Another principle is the principle of transparency. Here we recognize that in preparing for phase one, there was a process that was allowed for information exchange between member states. And, but we recognize that there may be a need for further information as we get into negotiation. So it's important that information sharing continues throughout the negotiation process. So the transparency principle tries to acknowledge that. Another principle is about building on the acquis. In line with what I've said on variable geometry, the coexistence of what already exists at regional level, it means that when we talk about the acquis, now negotiations at the tripartite level will be amongst those member states that currently do not have any trade arrangements amongst them, which means that South Africa will not negotiate with countries that are already party to the SADC trade protocol, but will negotiate with countries that it doesn't have any trade arrangements with, which means that it will mainly be the EAC, Egypt, Seychelles, it will depend on whether they finally accede to the trade protocol. They've already tabled an offer which is under discussion. It will be Ethiopia, Djibouti, all of those. So that's how acquis has been defined. In terms of single undertaking, you would recall that also there's a negotiation on the movement of business person, but this is considered to be under a separate track under phase 1. The single undertaking excludes that because the movement of business persons is negotiated, as I say, under a separate track. What we mean by single undertaking in terms of phase 1 will be only those issues that relate to trade in goods. So that's the meaning of single undertaking. Substantial liberalisation, it means that it will cover substantially all trade, and the modalities have defined what this is. From the onset, the coverage will be 60 to 85% at zero on entry into force. Then negotiations on the remainder, whether the coverage is beyond 85% will depend on the negotiations, but also will depend on the sensitivities, the exclusions that are normally allowed in trade agreements. But as we all know, there's no precise definition of what we mean by substantially all trade. Mostly it's around 80 to 85% coverage. So in the tripartite, it's 60 to 85% on entry into force, and then the rest will be negotiated over a period of 5 to 8 years. The next principle is MFN, most favored nation treatment, which means that any advantages that any tripartite member states extend to third parties would be offered to the other member states on the basis of reciprocity. The aim here is to ensure that we trade with each other on terms as good or better than non-tripartite member states. In terms of national treatment, what it means is that products of the territory of any tripartite state imported into the territory of the tripartite states shall be accorded treatment no less favorable than that accorded to light products of national origin. We've also said it will be based on reciprocity, which means that we'll grant each other mutually agreed trade concessions. Also important is on decision making, which means that we'll take decisions on the basis of consensus. So that those are the principles that are informing the negotiation going forward. Where we are currently in the negotiations is that we finalized the modalities for negotiations, and we are expected to undertake now national consultations on the offers based on the agreed modalities. And then within 6 months, which takes us to September 2013, we will be tabling offers. The negotiations are expected to be finalized by the end of 2014, which means we have one year, 3 months or so to finalize the negotiations, after which we will phase out, as I said, 60 to 85% on entry into force, and then over 5 to 8 years the remainder, but it allows for sensitivities, exclusions as allowed normally in trade agreements. Now, if you come to what is it that South Africa wants from the tripartite, I think in line with what has been said already by the two professors before me, we are operating in a changing global environment, and South Africa recognizes that there are shifts in the global economy, with mainly emerging economies growing and Africa being part of that growth process. And as South Africa, our aim is to ensure that we have access to a bigger market, of which Africa is an important part. I think all of this has been said before, that Africa is the second fastest growing region in the world after Asia, and there are many benefits to that. And in order to take advantage of this, the tripartite process is a contribution to that, to ensure that we have access to a bigger market. But we also recognize that for the potential for Africa is good, but it will only be realized if we focus on addressing constraints that are related to infrastructure development. We also address the issues of fragmented and small markets and inadequate diversification. Because the reason why intra-Africa trade is small is because we know from the experience that we've had in SADC that the market is, we've now reduced over 90% of tariffs are currently at zero, but it's only South Africa that has really been able to take advantage of that. The other countries have not really been able to because of inadequate productive capacity. So going forward into the TFTA, it is critical that we address all of those aspects. Hence, we have adopted a developmental integration agenda when it comes to the tripartite process. As I've said, the other objective is about boosting intra-Africa trade. If we look at currently where we are, we're currently at 10% in Africa. But I think an important point to raise is that if you look at that aggregate figure of 10% of intra-Africa trade, it's distorted mainly by oil exports because they're a bigger component of our trade with the global economy. And if you discount the oil exports, then intra-Africa trade increases by about 21%. And for most African countries, they count Africa as a second important export market for them, behind Europe. And the fundamental point to note is that most of intra-Africa trade is on manufactured goods, and we see that as an opportunity for us to focus on regional industrial development and the development of value chains. The other aspect of why we see the tripartite process as a strategic process for us is the fact that we have now agreed on pursuing a developmental integration agenda so as to address the shortcomings and relevance of mechanical sequencing of final stages in developing regions. The way we've approached integration in the past has been about adopting the final stages in terms of moving from PTA to FTA to customs unions. And we are saying our experience so far on what we have implemented, especially using the SADC integration as the basis, has been that if you only focus on trade or market integration alone without looking at the other aspects that influence trade, then the chances are that not all the countries will fully benefit and take advantage of that. Hence, it is important that we look at the major barriers to trade, which are often inadequate infrastructure, underdeveloped production structures, as I've said, rather than tariffs or regulatory barriers. And we're not saying those are not important, but we are saying that you have to look at these things in tandem. Therefore, it requires that when we approach integration, it should be complemented by advances in cooperation and coordination programs that will address the real economic constraints. So our approach to the TFTA has really been based on 3 pillars. And these pillars have been agreed by the summit when the TFTA was launched. The first aspect of it is market integration, which will be through the tripartite FTA negotiations. And as I've said, we are on course to now start with the negotiations. We are currently at a stage where we are preparing our offers. The second aspect is industrial development through the development of value chains. Here I differ a bit with the professors in that our approach to industrial development nationally, as well as looking at our integration into the region, has been about supporting the development of regional value chains. The concern that has been raised that we are mostly nationally focused without looking at the implication of the region. Maybe it's the fact that we are not communicating what we are doing very well. Firstly, I think the challenge that we have in the region is that very few countries have industrial development policies through which you can then find a legal framework within which to engage meaningfully on regional and continental industrial development. Currently, there are a number of countries that are in the process of developing their industrial policies. There are discussions in SACU on the development of a common regional industrial policy, which will ensure that we are able to identify complementarities in our national industrial approaches, so that we are able to, as I say, build regional value chains. So the process has started. SADC last year also adopted a SADC regional industrial strategy, which aims to lock in those regional value chains. And it takes into account the comparative advantages of member states. It also takes into account constraints that are faced by many economies in terms of issues related to SPS. So there are also aspects of capacity building that we have to look into. So it's a comprehensive program that aims to ensure that we are able to meaningfully promote regional industrial development. The third aspect of the work is the work on infrastructure development. In the tripartite, the North-South Corridor has been launched as a flagship program for infrastructure development. It focuses mainly on the development of road, rail, ports infrastructure, as well as improving efficiencies at the border posts. For example, in the North-South Corridor, there has been a launch of the Chirundu one-stop border post between Zimbabwe and Zambia. The number of projects that are being implemented and undertaken on road, rail, and ports, as I've said. The main aim here is to ensure that we use the infrastructure build program to catalyze industrial development going forward. And this can only be done through promotion of local and regional sourcing of inputs. There are discussions that are currently being undertaken on how we can actually do this. In South Africa, for example, on public procurement, we do have designations. So those could be various aspects that we look at in terms of how we actually promote local and regional sourcing of inputs. So the approach is therefore comprehensive, and the approach is therefore trying to ensure that in the end, it's not just about the negotiation of the TFTA, but it's about ensuring that all the countries that are party to the process are able to take full advantage of the benefits that will accrue out of the TFTA, which means that we have to look at aspects related to infrastructure development, but also how we address constraints which relate to inadequate productive capacity. Thank you, Chair.